Before we begin, I want to say something really quick. If you are a person who enjoys this game, who derives enjoyment from this game, then that's awesome. I really have I've said many times, think we need more enjoyment in life, and being able to enjoy life is awesome. I do have a favor to ask. If you do like this game, please do not watch this video. For the 3 of you remaining, how many of you have ever even heard of this game? It's got a little bit of a reputation, as one might say, for being bad, awful, terrible. And one of the things that I was wondering is how much of that is earned, because most of the time when people talk about it, they talk about the terrible localization, because the localization is terrible. It's one of the worst I've ever seen. 3 negative territory, one might say. But then I started playing the game, and I realized that this is the 3rd worst game I have ever played in my life. Legitimately. If you're wondering, the games that beat it are Hero Miro something something and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. This game pushed Mega Man X7 off of the altar of worst game I've reviewed. By 10 points, for those of you who know what that means. So we're going to structure this a little bit differently than usual. Because the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit of behind the scenes. There's not much. Not a lot of people have done not a lot of research on this not a lot of game. One of the things that I did here is there was this game that had come out called Dragon Quest. It did pretty well, all things considered. I just realized 2 of my 3 worst games of all times were Dragon Quest clones. I just realized that. Anyways, and both of them were made to try and capitalize on the financial success of the Dragon Quest series. That's troublesome, but let me start with this. A game company or a game team jumping into a new genre and trying something new is not necessarily going to return Drac. I mean, Metroid Prime is the obvious example here. Which, by the way, was done by Retro, not the original Metroid team. Although the Retro team was involved. But my point is, almost everyone involved in that project had never made an FPS before. And we got Metroid Prime out of that, so thumbs up. We also, though, have 2 very distinct approaches to this type of project. So, you're a gaming company or a gaming team, and you see that X over there is popular. You have 2 broad options. The first thing you can do is you can say, okay, we want to jump into that. Throw some time and effort and money and research and effort, and I emphasize effort, creativity, throw yourself into it, put yourself into it. And what you get is Suikoden 1, which if you remember in both my video and my stream on that, was the exact situation I just illustrated. You know, RPGs are big, the early PS1, let's figure this out. Suikoden 1, not a super amazing game, not the greatest game ever made, but you can tell that real thought and heart and design was put into it. So, big thumbs up. Or you could make this game. This is the example of bullet point syndrome at this point. When you look at something popular and say, oh yeah, do that, without the effort, without the time, without the budget, without the effort, without the creativity. You're just trying to ape what's popular because that sells, so I'm going to make that so I can sell. It's something that has absolutely plagued the mobile market for a long time now, but anybody who knows anything knows that this has been a problem in the gaming industry since the 70s. It is one of the contributing factors that led to the Atari crash everybody knows about. There's more than this to that. I don't want to get into it. You may notice I sound kind of tired and out of it right now. That's because streaming these games was legitimately draining on me. I'm not complaining. It was a good stream and everybody enjoyed it, and that's awesome. I recommend you go watch the VODs. We had a good time. But it was still tremendously draining, slogging through this game. Which brings me to my next point here. You know, they didn't know what they were doing, and they wanted to jump into a thing, and they had no idea how to do it. So what did they do? They made all the mistakes. One of the things you notice when you start to have a large enough sample size is you start to notice trends and patterns in what is where. When it comes to the reviews, one of the things I've noticed over the years is that a lot of the really good and really bad games both follow a similar pattern. They tend to have a lot of 1, 2, 3, certain aspects of game design are either really good or, conversely, really bad. Secret of the Stars didn't have that, because Secret of the Stars was bad in every way. I am not speaking facetiously. I know that we all like to meme a little bit. I like to meme a little bit, haha, blah, blah, blah. Sequel trilogy is the worst movie ever made, blah, blah. That's not real. I don't mean that. That's why I'm changing my tone here so you can understand that when I say that this game does everything wrong, I mean it. And that's my next piece of advice. And I mean this with absolute sincerity. In fact, I am going to take this to heart in the future. If you want to get into RPG design or RPG analysis, play this game or watch my playthrough of it and analyze this game or watch my analysis of it. Plug the stream channel. Because, as I've said many times, someone asked in the middle of the stream, why are you reviewing this game? In fact, why did you put viewer's choice to this game? Or dealer's choice, excuse me. Why did Savicom, who was the primary shareholder, person who donated, I think it was 87% of the donations for this game, why did she want this game run? And the answer is, well, there's a value in it. Now, I didn't think it would be as funny of a stream as it was, because holy crap. But even knowing just it was a bad game, there is a value in understanding the mistakes that people have made before you. They have already found those pits in the path. They've already fallen into them or tripped upon them. You can learn from that. To go back to Star Trek for just a second, one of the things that irritates me so damned much about Enterprise Season 1 is the fact that they didn't learn from the mistakes of Voyager, which itself didn't learn from the mistakes of TNG. Same team. I've talked about this before. It's actually more complicated than I'm making it to sound right now. But the point is, there was a team that worked on early Voyager, and then that team went to work on early Enterprise. And that team were vets from TNG, but they didn't carry forward their lessons. They just kept making the same mistakes over and over. And that's why Enterprise Season 1 kind of sucked. And why early Voyager kind of sucked, and why late TNG kind of sucked. Obviously, there's exceptions, but you get the idea. So, that's the kind of thing that this is valuable for. You want to make an RPG? Cool. Look at what this game did. Really look at it, and then don't do that. Or, try to do what they were attempting to do, and do it better. One of the questions I was asked during the game is from von Falkenstein, I believe, and he asked, how would I do a multi-party game better than this? My immediate answer, without even thinking about it, was FF6, and he said, well, that's cheating. And I was like, well, now hear me out for a second. Final Fantasy VI is a game I know extremely well. And I happen to know that one of the things it does very, 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 very well is dungeon design, encounter design, enemy design, itemization in terms of what items drop where, and the power progression curve. I've talked about this so many times. Most mechanics in games, and fiction in general, tend to interweave, right? You can't just make really, really good itemization, because if these other systems do not work together and support it, it just doesn't work the same, right? You want interlinking systems so that it can become better. Otherwise, you have interlinking systems which make it worse, like Secret of the Stars, but I'm getting off topic. You have all of that excellence of dungeon design. That already supports a multi-party scenario. FF6 is already, as is, designed so that if you had 2 parties of 4, you could keep them properly equipped and geared and itemed out and ready to go and relatively strong enough to keep progressing through the game if you just changed up the dungeon design to make it so that most of the dungeons were like the Phoenix Cave or Kefka's Tower. That's there in the game. That's already supported. Now imagine you didn't do that, and instead all of those interlocking systems I just talked about were terrible. What did I just talk about? So that was enemy design. It's just 5 seconds ago. You can tell this is wearying on me. I thought about waiting until tomorrow, but I want the fatigue to bleed out of me while it's fresh. I want you to understand what this game did to me. So, we've got encounter design, enemy design, and itemization, and power progression. I think there was a fifth thing, but we'll just go with these four for right now, okay? So, itemization. In Final Fantasy VI, there is very careful thought and effort put into which items are where, and some of them are gear, some of them are items. Most of them have a spread to them, so you don't always just get potion, 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 but you'll get like potion, ether, antidote, or potion, antidote, piece of gear. And it decides which one is where and when, which ones are optional, which ones are not, so that if you get lost, you still get rewarded for it. And if you don't get lost but know where you're going, you can go for exactly what you want. Or if you just want to beeline for the exit, you're probably not going to miss anything too badly. Now, there's a couple of exceptions to that, of course, but in general, the itemization and item placement is excellent. In Secret of the Stars, most of the items you get in the dungeons are healing items, which are outdated almost immediately. Within, I believe, let's say about the fourth or so dungeon in this game, you're still getting the equivalent of the very first tonic you would use at the very beginning of the game, which has long since been outdated. So it's useless items, in addition to having to go out of your way to get it. The enemies don't really drop much, that's part of itemization as well, and there's very little gear that you can find out in the wild that's useful, but hang on, it gets worse than that. Because in FF6, itemization isn't just in dungeons, it's also in towns, what you can buy when and where. This also ties into gold progression, how much gold you get from encounters, how much gold you get from chests, and then how much things cost. There's a balance to gold production and gold removal when it comes to an RPG especially. All of that's very well designed in FF6. In Secret of the Stars, you are perpetually starved for money, unless you go grinding, in which case you will have enough for a couple of items which are not really worth it. They only barely increase your power output overall. So, too little reward for too much effort, too much time, too much effort for too little reward. There we go. Let's get that in order. And that's Secret of the Stars. And this, you notice I'm still just talking about effectively dungeon design, right? Because then we've got encounter design. So encounter design is the specifics. Doom is the king of this. Specifics of what you encounter, like it's a God, I can't think of anything. It's a shark and a whale and a dolphin. And the whale does this, and the dolphin does this, and the shark does this, and that makes them into an encounter. And there's thought and effort you can put into which enemies do what and where, so that the enemies complement each other. That's Doom's 101, right? Like, that's what makes the combat so fun in Doom, is the amount of thought and effort that goes into the encounter design. There's not a lot of unique enemies in Doom, but there's a lot of good combinations for those enemies, right? So, in Secret of the Stars, you have enemies that cast magic, and then you have enemies that don't, and that's kind of it. Now, you notice how this is encounter design and enemy design kind of wrapped up into one. So, there's only really two types of enemies. Some of them are more weak to other things, like robots are weak to lasers, or other examples that probably exist. That's the only one I know off the top of my head. But for the most part, that doesn't affect anything, and also nothing indicates that in the game. That's not quite true. There is one way to find that info in the game, if you're lucky. In some cases, you will never learn that info. So, that means that you have all this crap that leads you to boring encounters with boring enemies, which are not rewarding, which kind of compounds the encounter design. And I could keep going. But if it's not obvious, the main point here is this is a game that has two parties. That's one of the main gimmicks. There's the Aquatillon, I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce it, and the Custera. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that one either. And these are the two parties. The first party is all magic users, and they're all about the combos, unifying attacks, which you get about 3/4 of the way through the game. And then there's the second party, the Custera. They're a more typical party. You've got like a monk and a wizard and a fighter and all kinds of stuff like that. So that's cool. But that second party is terrible. In every way, honestly. They have nothing to do with anything. They have more character than the main characters, which isn't saying much because the main characters have literally zero character, unless you count being turned into a lion as a character, or being kidnapped, which would apply to 3 of the 5 main party members. That's not a joke. In fact, in one of my favorite sequences, you meet one of the party members, Leona, and she's like, "Hi!" And then she's kidnapped, and then the very next step is to walk slightly further away in the same town and rescue her. This game has a bit of a kidnapping thing. Anyways, so the second party, the Custera, they suck because they don't share equipment or inventory, or gold, or anything with the main party. They can't even use the same doors in some cases, and more importantly than anything else, they cannot use the airship, and they cannot use the same ship. They do have another ship they can use, but they are very limited in what they can do. Okay, that sucks. But I realized very quickly that they were extremely optional. And that made it okay. Because otherwise I'd have to do every dungeon 2 or in some cases 4 times, because some dungeons don't have a shortcut out, in order to be able to progress through the game. But I could just ignore them. Cool. Oh, thank goodness. All right, cool. I'm going to describe something to you, okay? None of this is hyperbole. We've left Meme Town, as I said earlier. You have done all the steps. You've gotten all the things. You go to your hometown, and spoilers, your hometown is actually on top of a UFO from the future. Just go with it. So, you go in there, you plug it in, and the guy's like, hey, I'm going to let you look around for a bit. You're like, okay. There's only one thing you can interact with, and that one thing allows you to get a message which says, when the 5 are gathered, when the 5 something are gathered, it doesn't, I think it's like the 5 people of power is what it specifically says are gathered. The ship will take off and we'll go back to the future. And I'm like, okay, so we're here, 5 party members. Let's do it. Nothing happens. There's nothing else you can interact with in the room. No one and nothing in the game tells you what to do next. I played this game in 2022. I actually did play this game back in the day. Rented it by accident. I've told this story before. I'm just going to give the short version. Rented it by accident because the art looked cool and it reminded me of Secret of Mana, and there was a bit of a confusion there, and my mom. But the point is, I ended up renting this game by accident, played a decent ways into it. I can even point to the spot I got to, and said, wow, this game sucks. And I returned it and got another game instead. But we had the great fortune of one person popping into chat while we were streaming this game. And that person beat this game back in the day, which was 1993 in Japan and 1995 here in the States, for perspective. I'm going to just quote them with their permission. This game was described, beating it back then was described as getting a thing that I can't remember the name of. Oh God, I am really tired. Getting castrated during a car wreck. I agree with that. Because there was no walkthrough. There was no game facts. There was no Reddit. There were no maps. There was a map in the manual. If you had that, good luck with that. They weren't exactly lining the local bookstore with the strategy guys for Tecmo's Secret of the Stars. Assuming such a thing even existed, I wasn't able to find something like that. So, you just kind of had to make it up. So what do? For bonus points, pause the video right here and tell me, what do you do in the circumstance I just described? You got to the UFO, you gather the 5 things, you have 5 party members, what do? Jeopardy music. So here's the answer. There are 4 dungeons throughout the course of the game there's actually 8, but there's 4 relevant dungeons. These 4 dungeons, of the 8, you can only enter with the Kustera group. If you do, each one of the dungeons is almost identical, at least in terms of visuals and audio and enemy encounters and all that. And you push through them, and you pick up a quest item at the very end of the dungeon. One of which is iridium, so I like to think that none of these people are going to have children anytime soon, but that's neither here nor there. And you pick up all these radioactive materials, and you bring them back, and once you have all 5 radioactive materials, one of which you get from the main party, you interact with the UFO, and instead of saying, get the 5 things, it just turns on. There you go. Nothing indicates that you need 5 quest items. Nothing indicates... So that's important, because you don't know what you're looking for to begin with. Then, nothing indicates where those quest items are in the game. And even if you were to decide to go roaming through the world on your airship, which you have at this point in the time, remember, the other party can't use the airship, you would not find anything anywhere. Even if you somehow 100% at every spot that the main party can interact with, you would never find these quest items. You would have to get on the secondary party, get on the boat, and then go specifically to these shrines and go to the Kustera-only parts of the dungeon in order to be able to progress. I remind you, there are actually 8 Kustera-only dungeons. The other 4 have optional equipment and weapons, so that's just adding to the walkthrough-itis of this problem. And this is one plot point in this game. Just the one. That's the kind of game this is, right there. If I wanted to summarize the whole game, I just did it. We talk about the story, I guess. There's no plot. There's Tom Cruise. His name is a mistranslation of homunculus. He's evil. Later on, we find out that he's an artificial human created by a scientist from the future. He was evil, no reason given, and decided to go ahead and take all the science from the future, yes, all of it, go back to the past and conquer the world with darkness. Then he went to sleep. I have no idea why. He also apparently killed and or tortured all our parents, all our fathers specifically, excuse me. That's not really explained, and if you think about the timeline, it makes no sense. Then he woke up, and we run around, and we kill his generals who are desperately trying to kill us, because we're the only ones who can kill him, except they never try to kill us, they always just try to kidnap us. We already talked about that. Eventually, we get the 5 radioactive materials, go into the volcano, which is at the beginning of the game, and go kill Tom Cruise. And that's it. That's the plot. There's nothing there. You might say, okay, Laura, you're being harsh. Old JRPG, right? FF1 had a better plot than this, and FF1 predates it by about 5 years. And a system. No, FF1 did not have a phenomenal plot, but it still had more than this. That's kind of my point. Hell, Dragon Warrior, that is to say, Dragon Quest 1, had more plot than this. And that's kind of my point, too. One of the things we did, at a certain point, is we just sat and started comparing this to games that came out before it that were better than it. And the reason I kept hammering that point in, and I just hammered that point in. I won't do it here on this particular video, don't worry. It's because I wanted to make it very, very clear that, oh, it's old, or, oh, it's an early SNES game, or, oh, it's an old JRPG. None of that is an excuse. None of that. It doesn't get any credence on any of that. I will give some of the oldest of the games, in general, some credits when it comes to design. I will and I have. The oldest game we've reviewed at the moment is actually from 1988, for example. But this game came out in 1993 in Japan, and 1995 in the States. For a little bit of perspective, in Japan it came out after Final Fantasy V. In the States, it came out after Final Fantasy VI. Now, even if we ignore the FF6 and the States thing, the original game came out in 93. What I kept doing was pulling up games before this that did everything better. Which brings me to my next huge complaint about the game, because I'm already kind of done talking about the story. There's no characters. Let me just look down the list. So the intro is bad, the dialogue is awful, the localization is crap, there's cutscene incompetence, there's no characters, no theme, no plot, no world building. The internal continuity is bonkers. At one point in the game, you have a sword. You know, you've got like a sword back here, and you're like, ha-ha. And then you go to a town and they sell you a Vulcan minigun, which is a slight upgrade. I'm not making that up. Look it up. It's in the manual. There's a picture of a frickin' minigun in the manual. That is immediately outclassed, of course, by an axe. There's no internal continuity. None. So then we move on to the brickwork, and the visual storytelling, and the animation, and the doodads. All of that is... Those are the categories I tend to lump visual design into. I'm really big on visual design. Anybody who knows me knows that. And you know that I'm a sucker for details. I'm a sucker for polish and nuance. One of the reasons I tend to gush so much about games like Twilight Princess or Final Fantasy VI or even World of Warcraft is because they put so much into the visual design of the games. All those wonderful little details you will never notice. There was one point in the game today when it would have been part 3 of the VOD, if you want to go look for it, where I sat down and paused the game, save stated, paused the game, and went and started loading other games to demonstrate visual design. Now, I tried not to be mean, because, if I load Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, those games are going to stomp this game into the ground. But I tried to load older games, and games that aren't really known for their excellent visual design. 2 that come to mind immediately are Final Fantasy Mystic Quest and Lufia 1, both of which have what I would consider not good overall visual design. Both of them were substantially better than this game. I'm not going to run you through the whole 20 minutes. We actually zoomed in the camera a lot on this. because the game did visual design so badly. It was so bad I had to just hit the stream brakes and spend 20 or 30 or 40, however many minutes it was, just really demonstrating how much they were screwing everything up with regards to the design of their visuals. I pulled up Super Mario World and Link to the Past, games that predate this by years, when they weren't even sure what the SNES could do, in order to demonstrate how to do visual design better than this trash. And that's the story. Let's look at the gameplay. I like the penalty for failure. It's pretty much straight out of Breath of Fire 1. You die, you go back to the latest town. That's cool. I like that. You lose some gold. All right. There's a good fast travel system, pretty much copy-pasted from Dragon Quest. And the auto battle actually knows how to heal when needed. It doesn't know how to do anything else, and is actually bad because it'll literally do random attacks on random targets, so it has no idea what it's doing. But at least it will know how to heal, so that's cool. And those are all the positives, all 3 of them. I had a speech prepared in my head, and I was going to say something along the lines of, I'm not going to run through all 75 negatives to gameplay. But, let's do a quick run-through, shall we? So you start off the game. You're there, and you're in visual problem. I'm just going to get that out of the way. There's visual cancer in this game. It does not know how to use color palette. It doesn't know how to use repeating patterns. It doesn't know how to use shading. It doesn't know how to use gradient tiles. It doesn't know how to use anything. It looks terrible. Moving on. So, we start off the game, and we get our... Actually, we cannot leave the town, the first house, until we've talked to our mother, who tells us, first lines of dialogue in the entire game, hey, your father died a while ago, and you're sad about that, but you need to go find this item which is important to you. This is actually some of the worst As You Know I have ever seen, but that's going to be a recurring trend, so that's whatever. So then we go outside. You might think that's more on the story axis, and you'd be right. But then we go outside, and check this out. So you're on a little island, hard island, ha ha ha. There's a town, and there's a volcano in the middle. So you go to the town, you do some stuff, and you quickly run into a wall because you can't figure out how to progress. So how do you progress? How do you get into the volcano? Everything indicates you have to go into the volcano and beat the evil scientist. The answer, for the only time in the game, is to walk up to the generic hill tiles, which in every other case in the game you can't interact with hill tiles, and it will act as the entrance to the volcano, the hill tiles. Which are over here. Volcano's over here. And thus, we already start walking into another cardinal sin this game makes that a lot of games don't make. In fact, it's so rare this comes up, I don't think I've even talked about this before. Feedback. Feedback is how a game tells you what you can do, what you are doing, and what you have done. A little diddly-ling when you pick up a ring or an item or when you level up. The little visually and audibly when a chest opens. Something that indicates there's a switch on a wall, or maybe there's some kind of tile where you can interact with to advance a quest. Maybe there's a town on the overworld map. There's something. That's feedback. Critically important. It's so important that I have encountered precious few games that get feedback as wrong as this game. But this is a good example of absence of feedback. Cool. Then, you get to this wonderful part of the story. So you beat the intro, beat the volcano. You get piddling amounts of gold. And you also only have one party member for a game designed around having 4 or 5. I don't know why I did that. 4 or 5 party members. The piddling gold will buy you upgrades that are too expensive and too weak for what they are. We already talked about the itemization. But I'm just mentioning that it starts in literally the first town and the first dungeon of the entire game. So the itemization problem is right off the bat. You beat that, everything explodes. Don't worry about it. You're rescued by some dude who's totally from the future, wink wink, and you get placed in this other area. Okay. So, in this other area, you have no access to vendors. No inn, no weapons, no items, no armor. Itemization again, but even worse than before, because now you can't buy anything. You can't just go grind up gold and get more equipment. You can only grind experience, which you will have to do in order to be able to not only go fight this mini-boss, But go through another dungeon, a fairly long dungeon, get used to that, and then go ahead and fight the boss at the end, who is actually kind of hard at this point in the game, especially since at this point in the game you don't have a large party. You have 2 people by this point, and that's it. And remember, no ways to improve your gear, and no ways to refill your items other than whatever they put in the dungeon. And we already talked about that. You're starting to see the trends here, aren't you? You're starting to get more of a zoomed out picture of the fractals of how bad this game is. Because again, it's not one thing, it's everything. I already talked about the second party members and how worthless they are and how terrible they are. So we'll just move over that. Then you have to go find a key, which is just walkthrough-itis. I'm just going to walk through that. Then you have to go through a maze, which is huge and boring. Okay, so that's huge and boring. Then you have to go through another dungeon, which is very, very long, multiple screens. And that's when I remembered something. How many of you have played Final Fantasy IV? On the SNES preferably, but I believe all the versions have this. I suppose I should raise my hand for obvious reasons. Some of you may remember that in FF4, or 2 on the SNES, when you get to the second dungeon of the game, which is the waterway, you meet Tella, right? You've got Cecil and Rydia, you meet Tella. And you go just a little bit further, and the only way to progress is through this one door. That's important, because once you go through that one door, there's this weird thing on the ground. You're not sure what that is, and Tella says, oh, hey, it's a save point. Monsters won't attack us here. We can rest, use a tent, and save our game. And then they sit, and they actually have a cutscene there, where they sit and chat about their backstories and flesh out their characters, and then are all refreshed, and you can save your game. Why is this so significant? Because save points like this were new. I don't know if FF4 was the first game to do that. I'm not sure. But it was definitely one of the first games to do that, which is why they bothered to have an entire scene mandated so that players can understand you can save in the middle of a dungeon. This is this brand new concept, and it completely changed the dynamic of dungeon design. I talked about this on stream, too. I'm going to try to give you a truncated version. It's already getting longer than I thought it would be. A lot of dungeon design and encounter design boils down to how much recovery you allow the player to have. That's in your hands as the developer. You can have items in the dungeon, you can have monsters that drop things, you can have save points, you can have heal points, you can have recovery, you can have recalls, the ability to go back to town and then come back and whatever. There's all kinds of things you can do. All of that is recovery. That's all in your hands to allow the player to do. Now, one of the things you can do is you can design a dungeon to be one encounter. It's called gauntlet design. And so what it is you're supposed to go through the whole dungeon, and the whole dungeon is supposed to pull your resources down, and then you fight the boss or final encounter or whatever at the end at a lessened state. Now, a good game, whether it's pen and paper or tabletop or video, will make it so that this is all designed properly, so these encounters are not overwhelming. It's a nice smooth thing as you're going through. Each one of them challenges you in different ways, so they try to nick down your mana, or nick down your health, or nick down your items, or whatever. In other words, they each provide a slightly different challenge to allow you to slightly reduce your resources across the board, rather than just constantly mashing A through the whole thing. Then you get to the end, and the boss, if there is a boss, or the boss encounter, or the final encounter, whatever, should be designed around the idea that you, the player, are not at full capacity. It is designed to be more fought by someone who is at less capacity. If you manage to get through it with most of your resources, you're actually probably more set for that fight. If you manage to go through it and you're kind of behind, well, then you're worse off, and so forth and so on. And you could kind of visually see the gradient curve of player capacity when they reach the end of that dungeon. But that's gauntlet design. Now, here's the thing. The overwhelming majority of pen and paper, tabletop, and video games do not do gauntlet design properly. What they do is they look at Dungeons and Dragons, first edition, and they say, oh, that's a thing, and then they repeat that without knowing what they're doing, which, if you're paying attention, is the problem in general. It's just aping it. It's just bullet point syndrome. A lot of early JRPGs, most JRPGs from the 80s and early 90s have this exact same design. I'm going to go and just call it flaw. They design gauntlet dungeons without designing gauntlet dungeons. They don't know what they're designing, so they just throw it together in the way that everybody did before. I call that artifact design. They do it because they did it. Make sense? Now, the reason for bringing all this up is this game does not have save points. In fact, you can't even save on the overworld map. There is a specific NPC you can talk to save. That's it. Have fun. Cough, cough, aping Dragon Quest. Now, having all that under understanding, now keep in mind that dungeons have bad itemization, bad gold rewards, bad experience rewards, too many encounters for badly designed enemies, for badly designed encounters, and now we add one more thing to the mix of this wonderful stew of awful. And we just kind of plunk down, plunk, way too large of dungeons. Every dungeon in this game is at least 3 times longer than it should be. Some of this could have worked. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with a long dungeon. But as usual, there's no design to it. And it's almost always boring, samey corridors with no visual design. And again, getting lost just results in you getting lost, not getting rewarded, and there's no exploration benefit because so little items are worthwhile. Am I painting a sufficient picture of how awful this game is yet? Because I'm only down to about the 20s. The music in the game isn't bad, but almost every loop in the game is very short. And this game doesn't have different songs for different types of areas. This is the kind of thing that was starting to be popular about now, actually, in 1993. Because before this, there was like town. Every town had one song. All the dungeons had one song. All the fights had one song. If you're lucky, all the bosses had one song. That was kind of it, right? That's what this game has. But the problem is this sucks, especially when the fights are too long, and the fights are too many, and the dungeons are too long. And you start to see the problem. It also has the restart problem, which was solved back in the NES era. The restart problem is when the music restarts every time you reignite it. So, for example, if the beginning of a dungeon song is do-do-do-do-do-do-do, and then you get into combat, when you leave combat, it starts over again, as if it starts the file from the beginning. And just over and over and over. So it's 2 short loops, and it's repetitive, kind of by design, plus the encounter rate, which means you're going to hear the first 10 seconds of a lot of songs in this game. There's where I talk about feedback, power progression curve we've already talked about, difficulty curve, encounter rate, combat, interface. I don't even want to talk about the interface. So, the interface is bad. This is fun. Picture an SNES controller in your mind really quick, okay? Do I have one? Let's not knock over my water while we're at it, shall we? There's a PS1. There's a SNES controller. Give me a second. Hey. It's my wireless one. All right, here we go. Perfect. SNES controller, okay? I don't know how well you can see that. I can't see what you can see. Woo. So, there's actually a decent amount of buttons on this thing, right? Now, in the manual, it flat out says L, R, X, Y, and select are not used. Huh, that's odd. Why would you deliberately just never use literally over half the buttons on the controller? It's almost like you were designing it for a different controller. So, for all intents and purposes, these are your controls. This is already a problem. Playing any RPG with this few controls is going to lead to some problematic design, pretty much by default. I'm just going to leave these here. But opening the menu is the cancel button, which of course closes the menu, which you can already see how irritating that could be. But also remember that cancel doesn't always cancel, because sometimes the down arrow cancels. In order to actually access some parts of the menu, you have to move the cursor to the exit part, then cancel out, in order to be able to exit out of a particular menu. The nesting, the drilling down and the drilling up is terribly designed, and it's frustrating to use, especially given how often you're going to spend in the interface. Why would you spend so much time in the interface? Well, let me tell you about the inventory. You have 32 slots in your inventory. Gee, that sounds like a lot. First of all, no, it doesn't. Second of all, quest items take up space in your inventory. So does gear, until you equip it, so that's valid. But quest items and gear until you use it all takes up space there. Okay, that all sucks. That still sounds acceptable. And, honestly, that wouldn't be terrible. And I mean that. If not for the fact that items don't stack. If you have 20 plums in your inventory, then that is 20 of 32 inventory slots taken up with potions. Did I mention the game is grindy as hell? We actually only grinded once to gain 2 levels, specifically. It was about a 30-minute grind session for 2 levels, which may sound acceptable to you, but 15 minutes per level doesn't sound acceptable to me. Especially since I wasn't avoiding encounters until that point. I just wasn't high enough level. Every single dungeon and or boss in the entire game is prefaced by a grind section. There are many dungeons and many bosses in this game. Hang on, it's actually worse than that. Because what a good game will do is it'll design a gradient of increasing difficulty and reward. So, let me use a made-up example. Let's say you've got Town Dungeon, Overworld section, Town 2, Dungeon 2. So, you got Town for recovery, and you got Dungeon 1, and it's level 1 stuff. Then Overworld section, what you do is you have level 1 stuff outside the town, but as you start going over here east, I guess, from your perspective, you start to have level 2 stuff, and then when you go over here, you start to have level 3 stuff. So you have increasing difficulty the further you get over here. Then you have Dungeon 2, which actually has fully level 3 stuff. So you have level 1, 2, and 3 stuff all to level off of in terms of gold and experience in order to gradient your way up to be ready for the next dungeon. What this game does is there's the level 1 stuff, and then there's the level 3 stuff, and that's it. There is a cliff every time you hit a new zone with new enemy types, and it sucks each time, because you are always underleveled for it. Grind! There's this one part where you go into a desert maze. This is part of the feedback problem I mentioned earlier. And what happens is you go into the desert, and then you go into the town, and you leave the town, and it's like, "Mo-ha-ha!" And then he says some terribly translated dialogue, and then you leave. And you are on a desert area with random encounters, of course. Huge desert area. And there's the town. But if you go back into it, it just fades back out into your back of the town. It's like, okay, weird. What do? What I did is I went south to see the town. East saw the town. West saw the town. And north saw the town. So I'm like, okay, so it loops. No, it actually doesn't loop. So the next thing I tried is each time I tried going into several of these different towns, nothing changed. It always just went, and I'm like, okay, well, that's not the answer. So I looked it up for the sake of expediency. What it is rather than a looping tile, it's actually just a really large area with the tiles copy-pasted. And there is actually a loop. It's just like this instead of like this. Make sense? So there's one specific town. If you go into this town up here, that will actually release you. Nothing whatsoever indicates that. The only way you'll know you'll finally do that is because, the game goes, you're free, and the music changes. This game has teleporter mazes. Multiple of them. It has multiple party dungeons. I already kind of talked about that. The final dungeon is a dirt trail going through a completely black backdrop with the same damn dungeon music that you've heard several times up to this point in time. Actually, that's not true. Excuse me. That's not true. The previous final dungeon, the final dungeon leading up to that, was the same dungeon music. You get a slightly different song as you're going through the really boring spiral. Then you get to the last boss who kills you because you cannot kill him. But then you're saved at the last second, taken outside, told to get to the red fountain, which, okay, we remember where that is, right? Right? You remember where you went to at the very, very beginning of the game? I sure hope you do, because nothing else will indicate that it's there. We go into the hills, go to the red fountain, get the ultimate weapon of whooshing. And then once we have the ultimate weapon of whooshing, then we can go back all the way back through the dungeon again. Nothing's changed. It's just now we can kill the final boss, who isn't even there. We talk to a chair to interact with, to start the final boss fight. Then at the end of the game's like, hey, you did it. Congratulations. And the villain says, oh, darn. That's not a joke. You can look it up. At one point, the villain says, I hate you most of all. And the other guy's response to that is, oh, wow. And then they both die. Or something. I'm not actually sure what happened there. But it's okay, because then we go back to the future, except we don't. And then we go back to the future again. Also, we've got a UFO which has the whole town on top of it. At one point, one of the villains kidnaps one of the heroes of legend and has them completely helpless. So rather than killing them or doing anything to them whatsoever, they turn them into a lion, which I think would increase their killing potential. But it's okay, because that villain then makes him part of a circus and then carries the circus directly to the heroes so they can see the circus and see their friend who's a lion. It's like, oh my God. And then they're like, aha, and now I will leave and turn your lion friend into gold. So now you have a gold statue of a lion who's your friend. Did I mention the kidnapping thing? Here's another little fun one for you. Did you know that every time a new party member joins in either of the two parties, they join at super duper low level? We're talking like level 4, or at the very high ends, level 10. This can work, by the way. Final Fantasy IV did this exact same thing with Cecil. But the thing is, when Cecil rejoins the party at level 1, everything is designed around that. There's design there. He's fighting enemies that are weak to him and his new toolset, and he has the stats of, I believe it's about a level 20 of his previous self. I forget the specifics, forgive me, but you know what I'm talking about. So he's got the stats as if he's higher level, and he's got the gear, and all the enemies that he's immediately facing are weak to him. The game is designed to help him immediately catch back up. Even his leveling curve is designed around that. Like, there's a very big spike up, and then it smooths out. That's design. This is 3 drunk guys giving a hysterectomy in the middle of a car wreck. I hate this game. It was a fun stream, and thank you all of you who joined me for it. I hope you liked this video, because I want you to think about everything I talked about and never, ever make a game that does these things, especially to this extent. The worst part, I think, final thoughts. The worst part, I think, I need to throw up the thing too. I keep forgetting that because it's been so long. Tor killed the habit out of me. The worst part is a lot of these ideas I think could have worked. The multiple party idea, or the restarting with the lower level things, or the unique puzzle design, or the unique dungeon design, or the time travel plotter. A lot of this could have worked, and it just absolutely doesn't. But, right, so I keep forgetting. Let's go ahead and throw up the story score and the gameplay score. And I'm going to go ahead and throw up here the slightly more up-to-date spreadsheet. This is all of the RPGs. I've gotten some feedback. You don't want it to be transparent. Nobody wants to see my ugly face. So here is the spreadsheet for the current list. And as you can see, the game that is at the absolute bottom. Now, I'm actually going to have to pull up the numbers here to say them out loud, because I don't have those in front of me, because why would I do that? But Secret of the Stars. Let's see, that's negative 27 to story, with a story per hour ratio of negative 1.83, and a story ratio of 6.45%. God, that is awful. You might think that's the worst we've ever had. You'd be wrong. As you can see, Quest 64 is worse. But then we have negative 72 to gameplay, which is negative 4.89 gameplay points per hour. That's almost 5 negatives per hour on the gameplay axis, and a 3.85% ratio of gameplay positives, leading to a gameplay score, a final score of negative 60.51, smashing Mega Man X7, which isn't going to be on the document or the picture, that you're seeing. But Mega Man X7 is at negative 50.46. And the other big contender was Quest 64, which, as you can see right there, is at a negative 45.23. This game is awful. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts, and I will see you next time.